Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast with Ron and Kristin, where leadership meets entertainment. This podcast features stories with names and certain aspects that have been changed to keep submissions private. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast, where leadership meets entertainment. I'm Kristin, and I'm joined by my incredibly informative co-host, Ron Ward. Ron, we're excited about this episode. I really like your background for this because you're going to be able to add insight, opinion, speculation that a lot of others don't have the background to do so with. So for folks that don't know what we're talking about, I just want to put this out there. Details may continue to emerge on this topic. We're bringing you everything we know as of right now, as clearly and directly as possible. And today, what we found is a total train wreck.
It sure is. And just to lay, I know everyone doesn't know our background, but I was a deputy sheriff, a state probation and parole officer, a federal probation officer, later a federal law enforcement instructor, an academy director. And as a probation officer in particular, as a deputy sheriff, you drop people off and you work with the jail to some extent. And I even taught GED inside the jail, which was another story. But as a state and federal probation officer, you conduct pre-sentence investigations. So, Kristin, I have spent an inordinate amount of hours inside jail. So I do know somewhat of how they operate. And I certainly know when there are security measures that have been breached. And boy, are we going to look at that today.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's going to be pretty wild. And, the only background I have is being married to a police officer. And I'm kind of joking with that. But what he tells me is the jails don't mess around, at least here in Portland. He's like, yeah, they don't get away with what they get away with, with law enforcement officers. Once they're in the jail, it's very serious. But which is interesting, because as we dive further and further into this story, there were definitely some misses here. So 10 inmates gone, escaped, just like that. And the cherry on top, I love the spelling error. It was a message scratched above the hole they escaped through, and it said "too easy," LOL, but they spelt "too" wrong, right? T-O.
Should have had another O in there.
Oh, wow. I loved that. Like, that really just did it for me. And that tells you everything you need to know about the state of leadership, not only the mentality, but the leadership inside the Orleans Parish Jail.
Yeah. And we're going to look at the timeline, the total collapse and oversight, and the bigger question, are staffing issues and possibly even DEI initiatives pushing incompetence. And it looks like we may have a little of both here.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk to us about this great escape.
Okay. So I've visited Alcatraz out in San Francisco a couple of times. They called it the Rock. And there's a new study. There was an escape one time, Kristin, and the person, I think, disappeared. And they talk about that because it was a swim. If anyone knows, it's like a big moat where the Rock is. And by the way, I was privileged. I just want to do a shout out. My mentor, Dr. Sam Sample's name is on the main plaque when you enter Alcatraz.
Really?
He was the federal prison warden. When the Native Americans took it over and destroyed it, he sent inmates in there to rebuild it, repair it, and that's when they made it a tourist attraction. Alcatraz is a very interesting story. But as your husband Davis said, most jails, because of not only embarrassments from the past, but other crimes, it's the most intense situation where you want to have surveillance 24/7. You want to seal up any possibilities. You're always looking for things. That's why they search the cells to see if there's anything that, could be used as a weapon or escape tool. So we're talking about hyper vigilant when you work at a jail. It's not like a normal job. And once you begin to watch the news and you see breakdowns, one would think you would tighten up security even more. So let's talk about what happened on May 16th, 2025. 10 inmates at the New Orleans Justice Center escaped by removing a toilet and crawling through a hole in the wall. Boy, could I do some puns there.
I know. So yeah, a toilet. These guys literally pulled out plumbing to escape and nobody noticed. That had to have been noisy. And not until 8:30 the next morning, 7 hours later, was it realized that these guys were gone. 10 of them were gone and an entire toilet had been pulled out.
Yeah, and if you know, they always have the the razored fences. So they took their blankies with them, and they scaled the fences. And no guards, as far as surveillance, no guards saw a thing, and nothing broken, nothing removed. And as you said, Kristin, it's worth repeating that taunt over the door. When I saw that, I'm just like, I had to give them credit. Too easy. And it was too easy. It was the most truthful thing these guys have ever said. So it wasn't just a message to the correctional staff. It was a message to the public.
Yeah. And the inmates at that too. And the worst part, some of these inmates were facing charges for violent crimes. This wasn't shoplifters making a break. This was a major public safety failure.
All right, let's look at the psychology of these escapes. Tell us a little more about that, Kristin.
Yeah. So peeling back another layer. So these weren't just nameless inmates. These were individuals with long, violent histories, and understanding their psychology tells us even more about this failure.
Yeah, let's start with Derek Groves. He was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. This guy was involved in the bloody Mardi Gras Day shootings in 2018. That level of violence isn't random. It's usually rooted in detachment from empathy, antisocial personality disorder. We've talked about a lot of those things. And so this guy had major issues and should have probably been in solitary, frankly.
And now he's just running free.
Yep.
Next, we have Corey Boyd, just 19 years old, but already hit with murder and attempted murder and threatening a public official. So at that age, with that rap sheet, you're looking at someone who doesn't recognize authority at all. He's a walking time bomb, in my opinion.
Yes, and then we've got Anton Massey, I don't know if I pronounced his first name accurately, has been escaping from facilities since 2007. It's a hobby for him.
Wow. I bet he was the leader.
Yeah, and now he's charged with kidnapping and rape. He allegedly forced a maintenance worker to help with the escape, which we've already talked about that. That's not impulsive, that's calculated. Now that we know that, and I missed that earlier, he might have been able to manipulate this custodial worker. Who knows, because he's obviously good at it. Classic predator behavior from him.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And then there's Jermaine Donald, charged with attempted murder and obstruction of justice. He's a case study in manipulation and aggression. So another manipulator here. Same with Gary Price, multiple domestic abuse and assault charges. These guys were dangerous inside the walls, and now they're out.
And next, we've got Kendall Miles and Robert Moody, charged with contraband and weapons charges. These aren't street crimes. These are power plays inside the jail. It speaks to an internal hierarchy, control, dominance, all of those matters. My gosh, they got some bad people.
And that was while they were incarcerated. They got additional charges. And then there's, oh gosh, I'm probably pronouncing this, Dennis.
Or Dennis, either one.
Dennis. Armed robbery, carrying a gun during a violent crime. And that's someone who makes these violent decisions with full awareness.
Yeah, these weren't people who you could say were misunderstood. They were not victims of the system. There was none of that going on. These are violent, manipulative, seasoned offenders. And the fact that the leadership gave them an opportunity to escape is we've said enough, but it's mind-boggling. They took blankets and they all crawled through a hole. I'm surprised the whole jail didn't leave. I mean,
I would like to see pictures of that hole. It must have been pretty large.
Yeah.
To bring a blanket with your body. That's insane. But not one leader sounded the alarm before it happened. That one leaves me confused. That's where this story becomes more than criminal. It becomes psychological and systemic. And Oh, sorry, Ron. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to imagine the fear in New Orleans now.
I know, seriously. And, did you see the video of them running across the freeway?
I
All
did
10 of
see it.
them. It's like
Yes.
pretty wild. So let's take a second to talk about the people who live in New Orleans, to your point. Parents walking kids to school, business owners, families just trying to get by. What are they supposed to feel?
Yeah, and these people are going to get more and more desperate. So in most cases, they go to family or friends who are going to help hide them out, get them food. But if they don't have that, they're going to get desperate, and they are going to take another life. They're going to hold people hostage. I mean, they can just break in a house and live there, and nobody knows it for a period of time, and they know that. So this is it's caused a lot of scare, but also look at the distrust now that the local community is going to have and it filters over into law enforcement and government because they see this as a direct connection. So there's that mistrust now.
Yeah, complete betrayal. Social media is on fire with comments like, I don't feel safe anymore, or time to elect someone who actually knows what they're doing. And I don't blame them. That pressure needs to be there from folks who reside in the area.
Yeah, I totally agree. And to make it even darker, Sterling Williams, a maintenance worker at the jail, has been arrested. He allegedly turned off the water so inmates could remove the toilet. So
well, that makes
aiding,
sense.
Yeah, that's aiding and abetting.
Right. Exactly. No wonder they didn't hear the water rushing. He claims that he was threatened and said he did it because an inmate had a homemade knife. But let's be honest, is that even believable? Maybe the knife, sure, but did he really feel threatened? You don't make it easier for 10 violent offenders to escape because of one threat.
And Kristin, all jail employees, there's protocol for threats, bribes, because it happens so commonly. Of course, they provide training. Of course, he could have gone to someone and said, here's what I, was threatened about and all of that. So that's going to be very difficult for him to convey with any validity. So this is something that did concern me, though. This facility was running at 60% staffing. And remember, I mentioned the intensity and the vigilance you need to have. Well, 60% would be easy to not be watching a monitor or miss something that you should have gotten. So I think that it's going to have to be some serious explaining as to why there was only 60% staff in there. It should be at least 85 to 90%. Now, most people do leave a little cushion for hiring and changes, but it should not be at 60%.
No. And that's where we've talked about in previous episodes where I was always the manager that replaced people fast. One, I had a bench. I maintained a bench, so that process was seamless. But you have to do it quick. There were so many other bank leaders that took a long time to replace people that had left, and I never understood that. And that's what happens. You can get down to 60% staffing because of your inability to have a bench and then act on it. And this is where leadership either steps up or crumbles. And clearly in this case, it crumbled.
Yeah, it did. Let's look at the breakdowns in leadership. Enter Susan Hudson. Instead of leading from the front, she suspended her reelection campaign. She said she was taking accountability, but doesn't that mean resigning? Like, you're just not going to run for reelection, but I think you should just resign and move on. And Kristin, as an aside, I did work when I became a deputy sheriff. I worked in an area where the sheriff was elected. And it just blew me away that I'm enforcing the law. I'm arresting these people. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. And then about 4 or 5 months for the election, you're supposed to be handing out moonshine and doing all of, having liquor in your trunk. And I did refuse to do it, by the way. I promised the sheriff, I said, you're going to win my area because we cleaned it up. And he did win big. But boy, were the criminals mad at me when I didn't have liquor in my trunk. But that was a normal thing because you stock the trunk of your car full of liquor and in some cases, homemade moonshine.
I thought you were joking.
No, I'm not joking at all.
Serious.
As a matter of fact,
What?
I was with a one of my superiors, let's say. I think he listens to this podcast, by the way. So I was with Superior, and he says, "Hey, you want to go up on this mountain?" Now it's a rural area. Everyone, it's right. It borders
Western Virginia.
It borders southern West Virginia. It's Western Virginia, rural area. He said, "Do you want to go up in the mountain? I got to get something." So we get, and I keep asking what, and I thought we're doing investigation. He's got his mag light. I've got mine. He goes, "All right, we're looking for a big rock." And I'm like, "A big rock?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "There's supposed to be 3 jars of moonshine under there." And I said, "That's what we're doing?" So anyway, we found it, by the way. So, I don't want to brag, but
congratulations.
We found three jars of moonshine under a rock.
That is, if that's not West Virginia, I don't know it, or Western Virginia.
Just
I don't
move
know
on,
what
Kristin.
is.
Do the podcast.
Just like Ron, I think, well, gosh, were we even filming last week when you said this, that your dad had a friend who had a crow and he taught him to speak?
Look it up, people. Crows can talk. I don't know if we were on or off air. But
I was laughing so hard. I'm like, no, you're serious?
I started to say, Kristin will believe anything.
I can just see a guy with a crow on his shoulder, and they're just having this conversation.
They chatted a little.
You've
learned so much. You know what? Since I've come in your life, Kristin, you've learned so much.
I have. I am enlightened. All right. Back to it. So the press conferences, and I have listened to those, have been so weak. They're evasive, no real answers, just these soft explanations. And honestly, it's been more damage control than actual leadership.
Yeah, exactly. They provided no specifics, and they show that there's just no leadership. And I think the new premise is that if you delay long enough, the news cycle will move on. So, but they got these guys, 4 have been caught, but the remainder are still at large. So this ain't going to go away until they get those people caught. So I'm glad we're doing this.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, I like to sink my teeth into things. And actually, when I was doing research for this, I started it a few days ago, but then I went and made sure we had the most up to date as of 45 minutes before we recorded. And there are quite a few news outlets that are still covering this. So I was happy to see that it hadn't gone completely off the radar. I found that Sheriff Hudson trying to basically reassure the public, saying, I'm going to quote him here, "As your sheriff, I take full accountability for this failure, and it is my responsibility to make sure it is addressed with urgency and transparency." And it sounds good, but actions speak a lot louder than statements.
I think you said he. I think his name is Susan.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
I'm so sexist.
Anyway.
Pardon me.
She went on to admit that was an inside job. Of course, she's got to find someone to blame, and that there were intentional wrongdoings. She said this was a coordinated effort aided by individuals inside our own agency who made the choice to break the law. That's a brutal indictment on her own team. Yet, somehow she's still in charge. She hired these people. These people are already employees. There should have been red flags.
Yeah, there were a lot of things. It's weird. I can't get over. So the janitor turns the water off to make it easier for them. But what was... what was the win for him? What was the gain for him? I kept thinking, just my humorous side of me couldn't stop but think, but was he getting paid off in Top Ramen, right? That they get, I'm like, seriously, because they get that in those little stores. What was the gain for him? I just don't understand that.
I am so glad you mentioned that, because we have had stories about people either falling in love with inmates or being mesmerized by inmates. Of course, there's bribes. Of course, there's threats. I mean, it's not impossible for this person, depending on their emotional intelligence, if they thought that, someone was going to harm them. The last thing you would think is you want to let them out. But I did wonder what was in it for him. And it could seriously be that he was mesmerized and dictated by these individuals. But because it's hard to say you're going to get a bribe when good and well these people ain't going to march down to get their ATM card and give you a bribe.
I know. Exactly.
So it's complex. I'm anxious for the real details to come out in this case.
Right. Same here. And who knows if they will ever give us
True.
everything. But, even worse than what I've already shared, when the chief of corrections, Jay Mallet, was asked to provide specifics, he said, "I cannot reveal certain details given the ongoing investigation." So basically, we screwed up, but we're not going to tell you how.
Don't you love that? That ongoing
Yeah.
investigation has rescued so many, almost
Oh,
much as
yeah.
the Fifth Amendment,
Yeah.
So,
Lack of transparency.
yeah, that was not a shocker.
Mhm.
Governor Jeff Landry did not hold back, however. He blasted the entire progressive platform with this jab. The irony of the progressive promises that have been made to this city is clear. New Orleans handed the jail keys to those who vowed to keep criminals out of jail, and sadly, today we see that it worked.
Wow. That's a little change in the trajectory we're seeing here.
They keep them out of
Um,
jail with a hole in the wall, but go ahead.
He also promised action. So he said, "We're going to hunt these folks down. We're going to find them." I'm quoting the gonna find them, and we're gonna bring them back to a jail that they can't break out of. And that is what accountability sounds like.
Yeah, and get this. Police Superintendent Ann Kirkpatrick admitted she only found out about the escape through the media reports. She said, "I was notified by a police captain at around 10:30 a.m. and only verified the captain's claim by looking at media reports about the escape. That's a communication failure in epic proportions. My God, she found out inmates are missing. What happened to counts?" Never mind. Go ahead, Kristin. My blood pressure started going up there.
I heard it.
I think I see one of those guys out my window. Go ahead.
Oh my gosh. All right. So let's talk about Sterling Williams, the maintenance worker. We're going to go back there, who allegedly, we're going to say allegedly, helped facilitate the escape. So at this point, who knows? He could be the scapegoat in all of this, right? No pun intended. So at this point, no formal disciplinary history has been released to the public. But here's what is concerning. He was reportedly not thoroughly vetted and was given access to sensitive areas despite having minimal oversight. And that is a leadership problem.
Yeah, and as far as vetting, he could have a criminal mindset. He could just wanted these people to get out of jail. Maybe he believed they shouldn't be in jail. So, you got to have pretty extreme background investigations on people who are operating correctional facilities. And it wasn't just Williams. At least 4 employees have been suspended pending the investigation. So far, officials are refusing to name them or disclose their records, citing ongoing investigations. But the secrecy is frustrating to the public. If you're going to rebuild trust, you start with transparency. And I feel like we may somehow get in a love triangle here. I'm just feeling that way. Or maybe a love box. You know what I'm saying?
Love box coming on.
I feel it. Love.
Hey, I'm still, even with all of our investigations into this, I'm still scratching my head with a few things. Like motive and gain. And so, something's got to come out of this. But, when an organization is full of skeletons and nobody wants to open up that closet, it tells you everything you need to know really about its leadership.
Yeah. And also the fact that the sheriff only suspended her, campaign. And because honestly, this is so extreme that when you talk about transparency, she should have resigned. She might have wanted to lead the investigation, but to say immediately when these are caught, I'm going to resign. My chief deputy is going to take over or whatever. We're seeing nothing concrete to show us that there's any transparency and that there's real change coming.
Right. Reminds me of the Secret Service with what happened.
Yeah, good. No, that's a very good point.
Just like, eventually she did resign, probably a forced resignation, but.
Let's go a little bit more into the facts. We've already said that staffing was at 60%. Surveillance systems were outdated. Imagine that.
Yeah.
And of course, the security lapses were systemic. This wasn't like a one-off. This had probably been going on for maybe years. And again, I would love to know more.
Exactly. It wasn't the first red flag, and reports from jail inspectors had already pointed out serious vulnerabilities. So this escape wasn't a freak occurrence. It was inevitable.
Yes. And from a leadership perspective, when you ignore warnings or red flags, as we call them, and you can't act shocked when everything implodes around you. I remember talking to a leader, and this person had done some really things that damaged the company's reputation. And the person started telling me all the red flags. And I'm like, are you kidding me? You should have dealt with this. Like,
Right.
you could see it coming, and this was inevitable, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. It's like an audit in the bank, right? So the auditor comes out, they tell you what's going on, where there's some gaps, you fill the gaps. If I were to be audited a second time and any of those gaps still existed, the point that you're hit on is like doubled. The severity is doubled if you don't bridge those gaps. And it doesn't sound like there was that type of accountability here. And you touched on DEI initiatives versus competence just a little bit in the intro, and I'm going to go somewhere that most don't want to go. Sheriff Hudson campaigned hard on progressive reform, and she pushed DEI initiatives focused on making the jail system more equitable. And it just leaves me wondering, did that push lead us to where we're at today with what we're reporting on?
And I know Kristin and I have been very clear that we're all about inclusion, but we have looked at the fallacies in DEI over 2 or 3 different episodes. And we're not trying to scream DEI at everything, but when a sheriff wants to put that on the campaign platform, one would think that she would certainly seal up the cracks to make sure that her message doesn't get destroyed. So you just have to ask yourself, was this exacerbated by DEI?
Yeah, exactly. Again, I'm seeing a lot of just some comparison. I'm comparing this to what happened with the Secret Service failures. And again, that female's number one focus also was DEI and hiring women. Okay. So again, there are some trends here. And, when the focus shifts to appearances and not function, bad things happen, period. Like 10 violent inmates escaping through a plumbing hole and laughing about it.
Yeah, and I think what happens is we take our personal, she had this ambition and this personal, I guess, her values to try to promote DEI. But when you're running a jail, everything is about safety, and anything else is just subordinate to that. So she was not focused enough on safety. She got off on her little personal tangents.
Right. Yeah, you're spot on there. Now, I want to just talk about leadership breakdowns in other jails, because it does happen. This is not an isolated incident. So it's not just a New Orleans issue. In 2015, 6 inmates, I don't know if people can think back that far, but 6 inmates escaped from the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York by tunneling out, like a Shawshank Redemption situation. And that case exposed poor staffing and corruption.
Yeah, and then I mentioned a little bit about a love triangle, but back in 2022, there was an Alabama manhunt when corrections officer Vicky White helped inmate Casey White escape, and there were red flags there too. It always comes back to the same thing: leadership blind spots. People knew something wasn't kosher with those two.
Wait, did they end up getting married or something, or did they just have the same last name?
I am not. That's a good point. I'm not sure about that, but I know it had a bad ending. They're not off on an island somewhere.
They're not. I know. I'm like, wait a minute. I guess I missed that because I watched a documentary on that too. I guess I missed that they had the same last name. But speaking of New Orleans specifically, this isn't their first rodeo in this arena. So in 2009, Arthur Johnson escaped from this same jail, then called the Orleans Parish Jail, and was on the run for 3 weeks. He even made a video of himself walking around Bourbon Street before being recaptured. I wonder if he collected some beads.
Kristin, good point. I always try to bring in a special something for those who stick with us. So I've got a very quick story. I had this individual who was on bond, and in part of federal court, we did U.S. pretrial services where we supervise people on bond, and this individual skipped out. So we've got the U.S. Marshals looking for him, and it turns out his wife became my informant. She's literally
Oh.
telling me where he is. So at one point, he called me, and he was in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I just talked to his wife an hour before. So he calls me from a payphone, and he was on drugs. So you can imagine he thinks because I'm a Fed, we probably have flying saucers or something. So I just said, hey, before we get off the phone, because I was trying to, coerce him to come back.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm going to use the word Mike. That was nice.
Come on back to Rombo.
I said, hey, Mike, before you get off the phone, how's the weather there in Harrisonburg? There was this long hesitation, and
Love
then
it.
slam, the phone went down. But finally, he ends up back at his residence. He calls me and says, I'm coming in the morning. I'm going to spend the night with my wife and kids. I went down to see the magistrate judge. And of course, she said, oh, no. And a few minutes later, the U.S. Marshals kick his door in, arrest him. And the first words out of his mouth is that SOB Ron Ward, I'm going to kill him.
Oh, geez.
It was all my fault. So there you go, folks. That's why you
goodness.
always want to stay to the end, toward the end.
Yeah. I think they're still married.
Oh, Lord, no. Okay. So because Kristin and I try to stay real time here, I looked up the jail escape of Casey White.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it says that White, who was awaiting trial in a capital murder case that was in the Lauderdale County, Florence, Alabama, correction officer Vicky White, no relation, engineered and facilitated the escape. And the manhunt was covered by the media, of course. And I'm going to see how this ends here. They ended up crashing their car. Vicky White shot herself in the head. That's right.
I did not remember that. Oh, wow.
So anyway,
I'm assuming she did not survive.
It doesn't
her
appear
injuries.
that
Wow.
she did.
Jeez. How does that not remain in my memory bank? I don't know. Oh, that's horrible.
Well, at least we got the facts out.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Horrible. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
Oh,
I'm
my
here for
goodness.
you, Kristin.
Thank you. Need the support system.
Let's wind it down.
Yeah. So, I think really let's bring it back here. So you don't fix problems by renaming a building or pretending the past didn't happen. Leadership means that you root out the issues, culture, process, personnel, and that you don't stop until it's clean.
No, that's exactly right. And there are so many leadership lessons. I know we're talking about a prison, but there's so many leadership lessons in this. And even to the point of, Kristin, we talk about social media or we talk about ad campaigns and things. And I was talking to a business owner who was doing the exact same thing they've been doing the past 10 years. And they said they weren't getting any bang for their buck. And you literally scratch your head. You're like, don't you think maybe you should try something new?
Yeah.
You mentioned, or we've mentioned in podcasts before about a gap analysis. You find out where the gaps are. And obviously there was one behind the toilet,
Under.
You do have to do a gap analysis on a regular basis. Right. We should do that in our personal life. And you and I have said that.
Should.
So we won't. So let's look at we've made a lot of leadership points here, but let's break a few down. First, it means anticipating weakness. We talked about a gap analysis, but you got to look at personal behavior. A lot of times gap analysis is more in your numbers game. Right. Wherein if you look at human behavior, you have to look at personal characteristics, and you certainly have to do that when you've got inmates. That's why they do psychological exams on them, and that's why they're always being monitored. And once again, either that was ignored, not done, we don't know for sure, but there was a lot of exposure here.
Oh, yeah. And it also means surrounding yourself with competent, courageous people who speak up when something is off. I know police officers have an oral board, and there's community members involved in that. I used to be one of the oral board interviewers. I don't think that that's happening with prisons or jails based on my research, but that includes deputies, your staff, and even maintenance workers. When you're in that type of space, you have to be considering all possibilities.
is a leadership lesson. You always want to look at your infrastructure. Culture matters, of course. Training, and I am going to be, because I was the head of a training academy, I'm certainly interested on the level of training that these individuals got. And I'd love to know what kind of training the custodial person got. That would be interesting.
Right. Yeah, it bothered me when I was reading that the folks that did get put, I don't know if they're fired at this point, but they're at least put on leave. They were all lower ranking individuals. And that's, unfortunately, that's how it usually goes.
Yeah.
We're going to punish those on the bottom, and the folks on the top seem to get away scot-free. And that's not how it should be, because generally the people on the top failed and it trickled down. It's not in every single case, but that's generally what we're going to see. And, leadership isn't reactive, it's proactive. So it irks me when I don't see that accountability on top. Great leaders aren't just visible when the media shows up. Where were they? Where were they training? Were they providing adequate solutions? And just, were they there for folks when they needed something? And I'm thinking they probably were not.
No, it's true. I know we have some corrections officers that listen. I'd love to see if we missed details. If you have some insight, please reach out to us. We always love to hear from listeners from any country. Kristin can interpret it. It doesn't matter.
I do
she
my
has
best.
AI.
Me and AI are tight. No, it is interesting. And so, and that's the thing. That's what happens when you don't have crystal clear transparency. You're left to speculate. And so that's something, we can only do so much with the information we have. So if you want to help us fill in the gaps, by all means.
Yeah, and now thoughts and prayers are with the citizens. We don't know if they're still in New Orleans or in other states, because if they're smart, they're going to head into other parts of the country. But I don't think people are safe until these guys are apprehended. I think 6 of them are at large. At least that's the last I heard. And again, these are not, misunderstood white-collar crimes. These are dangerous people. So I just hope we don't hear anything worse. But we're certainly willing to come on an update if something else major happens in another episode. But we really, really appreciate you for listening, watching, being a part of this journey with Kristin and I.
And
thoughts, Kristin?
This show, it's just a good reminder that, as always, this show isn't about tearing people down. It's about exposing the real world consequences of poor leadership, or the dirty side of leadership, right? We can do better, and we are here to highlight that.
Absolutely. All right, everybody, be the leader you're meant to be.
We'll see you next week.
The Dirty Side of Leadership podcast is brought to you by Forward Operations. If you'd like to book Ron or Kristin for speaking events, training, or executive coaching, visit forwardoperations.com. Be the leader you're meant to be.